it's hard to believe that we are here with our last lesson on Paul, our history timeline link of Paul. All right. You are the light of the world. Matthew 5:14, our Bible verse. You are the light of the world. Matthew 5:14. So we are to spread the gospel light, which is Jesus, to the whole world. He was our light, and now he gave us the job of spreading that light around to the whole world. All right, so we are finishing up with Paul. Well, last time we left, Paul had been shipwrecked on the island, and not one of the men on board the ship died. They all made it to the island, and then a miracle happened when Paul was bitten by a viper snake, a very poisonous snake, and he did not die. And it surprised the men on the island and the people that lived there. It also surprised the prisoners that were on board ship with him, and it surprised the captain and the captain and his men, as well as the Roman soldiers that were guarding the prisoners. So he was able to witness to them because of what happened through the snake bite. All right, so Paul made it to Rome, and he was sentenced for 2 years in a house prison. Okay, so he was sentenced. Basically, he could not leave his house. All right, and Roman soldiers lived there too to make sure he did not leave the house. So for 2 years, that's what he did. Now, Paul could have been fussing. Why am I in prison? What am I doing in here? Nobody loves me. But instead, he chose to bear his plight, what had happened to him, with joy, and to work hard to find ways to continue to spread the gospel light of Christ even while he was in prison. So this is what Paul did while he was in prison. Remember all the churches that he had established on his journeys, on his missionary journeys, and everywhere he stopped at a town, then that became a church. Well, he wanted to keep encouraging those people. He could not be with them right now because he was in prison, but he did not want them to think he had forgotten them and that the gospel message still should be happening in their churches. And so he took time to write them letters. And we have those letters today in our Bible. So most of the New Testament, when you turn to the back of your Bible, most of the New Testament are letters written by Paul. So these are letters that he wrote to the churches to encourage them in their faith, to remind them of how to act and how to behave as Christians. All right. So we have, and this is a good little thing that I wanted to show you the books. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the 4 Gospels that come first 4 books of the New Testament. Those were written by men that had been with Jesus, right? And then we have letters that Paul wrote. We have the book of Acts, which was believed to be written by his friend Dr. Luke. And Dr. Luke wrote Acts, and Acts is basically telling you the story of Paul, his missionary journeys, and those lessons that we had where he was in prison and the things that happened to him. Also other churches, Lydia, where he preached to the lady who owned purple, and she believed and became a big supporter of Paul. So in the book of Acts, we find the lessons about Paul and his missionary journeys. And so if you wanted to read more about Paul, then your parents would have to open the book of Acts. But while Paul was in prison, then he began to write these letters, all right? And they look like this. So our letters are written on a piece of paper. We put them in an envelope and send them. Well, they didn't have pieces of paper like that. Instead, they had scrolls. And so they would write on these scrolls, and then you would roll it up and send it to the church by a messenger, okay? And the churches would send people to minister to Paul and bring him goods and things that he might need, and then he would send a message back. So we have these letters that he wrote. He wrote Thessalonica, or Thessalonians, to the Thessalonica church. He wrote Galatians to the church of Galatia. He wrote Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, to the church of Corinth and Rome. He wrote Philippians to the church at Philippi. He wrote Philemon as a message to Philemon was a runaway slave, and he wrote that letter for Philemon to give to Onesimus, his owner. Ephesians, he wrote for the church at Ephesus. Philemon, we already talked about. Colossians, he wrote to the church at Colossae. All right. Then he wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy as a letter to Timothy, who was helping to run the church in Berea. All right. So he wrote those to remind him of how he should act and how grateful Paul was at how Timothy was doing. All right. Titus, he also wrote. Hebrews, verse. Yep, I think I just want to make sure I covered them all. All right, so we're looking through there then at the ones that he wrote. Now we have 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, which was written by John the Apostle, and he also wrote Revelations while on the island of Patmos. And Peter wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. And then Jude was written by James and Jude, the brothers of Jesus. All right? So you have all those books. The majority of the books in the New Testament were letters that Paul wrote while he was in prison to the people at the churches that he loved. And there are so many lessons, even though they were letters to those people, there are so many lessons that we can learn from them. In fact, 1 Corinthians, he wrote to the church in Corinth, and they were having trouble remembering how to act. So he sent them a whole letter on how do you act and how do you love one another. And how do you take care of one another, and how do you have Christian character? So, there are many messages within there that we can learn. So 1 Corinthians 13:11 says, when I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I had to put away childish things. So as we get older, we no longer act as children. We start to take on grown-up responsibilities, and we change the way we act to handle those grown-up responsibilities. So see how he had written that to the church in Corinth? But does that work for us today? Yes. What happens if you had a whole lot of adults acting like children, and the children were running the world? What would we do? No, as we grow older, we take on actions and act like adults, and we put away those things that are childish. So those are things that we can learn from his first message, or his first letter to the Corinth church. Also, 2 Corinthians 13 gives us, things that help us to do things that are right. And, how many times do I have to tell you this, he said. But remember, when he wrote those letters, he didn't want to talk about Paul. He wasn't writing them to say, Paul, I'm Paul, I'm in prison. Look what I've done for you. I've run all over the country trying to start churches and preach the gospel. Wow, I'm such a special person. No, he wrote these letters because he wanted you to know Jesus. He wanted you to know the Messiah. And so when he wrote to Corinth, he did not write them because he wanted to be puffed up and, oh, look at Paul, what Paul has done. No, he wanted them to remember that, now I pray to God that you do no evil. I'm praying for you. But more importantly, I want to tell you these things because this is Jesus, and I live for Jesus, and I traveled the world for Jesus, and I'm in prison because of my love for Jesus, and I want to keep letting his light shine to the whole world. But I don't want you to think of Paul. When you think of Paul, think of all the wonderful things God has done for Paul and enabled Paul to do to the world. So he wanted you to remember those things, all right? And, in Ephesians, he told us how to put on the whole armor of God because we can stand against the devil. So he gave us all the ways that God would have us to stand against the devil. And he wrote that in the book of Ephesians so that you today could read it yourself. You might not be from the church of Ephesus, but you are a Christian and you're from a Christian family. Then you can open the Bible and say, oh, look at the things that I can learn from Paul writing to those books. So God, said, Paul, write these things down. Write these letters. Tell them all these things that you need to tell them. Tell them about me. And Paul said in Philippians, for me to live is Christ. All right? So for me to live, I'm able to show Christ. But when I die, guess what? It's my gain because as a Christian, I get to go live in heaven with him, with Christ in my heart. When I die, the gain is that I get to live in heaven for eternity with the God that loves me so much that he sent someone to die on the cross for me. So he wrote that to the Philippians in Philippi, and he's writing it also because God knows one day we would need to read that and we would need to hear that message ourselves. Okay, so these are important letters that he wrote that have so much meaning for us today. And so Paul was very important to spreading that gospel. We could have just had the gospel in Jerusalem until God sent someone by the name of Paul to start spreading that across Asia Minor and then into Europe. And eventually it will get to England. Now, Paul doesn't make it all the way to England, but eventually someone from one of these churches makes it all the way to England. And then you have a group of people called the Puritans who believed in that true God and followed his words and read the Bible and those letters from Paul that taught Christians how to act. And they believed that they should not follow the King of England. And then those Puritans brought the Bible over to the New World when they came and established the colony in Plymouth. And it all started with Jesus coming and being that light and dying on the cross to save us from our sins and giving us that good news. And then his disciples began to spread it around Jerusalem and the areas around Jerusalem. And then he called that special missionary Paul. And Paul was able to spread it across into Europe. And so maybe God has a special mission for you, just like he had a special mission for Paul, to find someone to spread the gospel to. And they may come into your life when you are young, or it might be when you're older. And he has a special mission for you to help spread that gospel. So any chance you get to tell someone, Jesus loves me, this I know, take it. And spread that light across the whole Pennsylvania and then the whole United States. And then maybe someday you'll get to spread it far parts of the world. All right, so let's sing our This Little Light of Mine song. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Won't let Satan it out. I'm gonna let it shine. Won't let Satan it out. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All right, and you can do all the other verses that we have and continue singing that. All right, we will see you next week.